Beatles were an English rock band formed in Liverpool in 1960. The group, whose best-known lineup comprised John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr, are regarded as the most influential band of all time. They were integral to the development of 1960s counterculture and popular music's recognition as an art form. Rooted in skiffle, beat and 1950s rock and roll, their sound incorporated elements of classical music and traditional pop in innovative ways. The band later explored music styles ranging from ballads and Indian music to psychedelia and hard rock. As pioneers in recording, songwriting and artistic presentation, the Beatles revolutionized many aspects of the music industry and were often publicized as leaders of the era's youth and sociocultural movements. Led by primary songwriters Lennon and McCartney, the Beatles built their reputation playing clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg over 3 years from 1960, initially with Stuart Sutcliffe playing bass. The core trio of Lennon, McCartney and Harrison, together since 1958, went through a succession of drummers, including Pete Best, before asking Starr to join them in 1962. Manager Brian Epstein molded them into a professional act, and producer George Martin guided and developed their recordings, greatly expanding their domestic success after their first hit, Love Me Do, in late 1962. As their popularity grew into the intense fan frenzy dubbed Beatlemania, the band acquired the nickname, the Fab Four, with Epstein, Martin and other members of the band's entourage sometimes given the informal title of Fifth Beatle. By early 1964, the Beatles were international stars, leading the British invasion of the United States pop market and breaking numerous sales records. They soon made their film debut with A Hard Day's Night, 1964. From 1965 onwards, they produced records of greater complexity, including the albums Rubber Soul, 1965, Revolver, 1966, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967, and enjoyed further commercial success with the Beatles, also known as The White Album, 1968, and Abbey Road, 1969. In 1968, they founded Apple Corp., a multi-armed multimedia corporation that continues to oversee projects related to the band's legacy. After the group's breakup in 1970, all four members enjoyed success as solo artists. Lennon was shot and killed in December 1980, and Harrison died of lung cancer in November 2001. McCartney and Starr remain musically active. The Beatles are the best-selling music act of all time, with estimated sales of 600 million units worldwide. They are the best-selling act in the U.S., with certified sales of 183 million units. They hold the record for most #1 albums on the UK Albums Chart, most #1 hits on the Billboard Hot 100 chart, and most singles sold in the UK. The group were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, and all four main members were inducted individually between 1994 and 2015. In 2008, the group topped Billboard's list of the all-time most successful artists on the Billboard Hot 100. The band received 7 Grammy Awards, 4 Brit Awards, an Academy Award, for Best Original Song Score for the 1970 film Let It Be, and 15 Ivor Novello Awards. Time magazine named them among the 20th century's 100 most important people. In March 1957, John Lennon, then aged 16, formed a skiffle group with several friends from Quarry Bank High School in Liverpool. They briefly called themselves the Blackjacks, before changing their name to the Quarrymen after discovering that another local group were already using the name. 15-year-old Paul McCartney joined them as a rhythm guitarist shortly after he and Lennon met that July. In February 1958, McCartney invited his friend George Harrison to watch the band. The 15-year-old auditioned for Lennon, impressing him with his playing, but Lennon initially thought Harrison was too young for the band. After a month of Harrison's persistence, during a second meeting, arranged by McCartney, he performed the lead guitar part of the instrumental song, Raunchy, on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus, and they enlisted him as their lead guitarist. By January 1959, Lennon's Quarry Bank friends had left the group, and he began his studies at the Liverpool College of Art. The three guitarists, billing themselves as Johnny and the Moondogs, were playing rock and roll whenever they could find a drummer. Lennon's art school friend Stuart Sutcliffe, who had just sold one of his paintings and was persuaded to purchase a bass guitar with the proceeds, joined in January 1960, and it was he who suggested changing the band's name to Beatles, as a tribute to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. They used this name until May, when they became the Silver Beatles, before undertaking a brief tour of Scotland as the backing group for pop singer and fellow Liverpudlian Johnny Gentle. By early July, they had refashioned themselves as the Silver Beatles, and by the middle of August shortened the name to the Beatles. Alan Williams, the Beatles' unofficial manager, arranged a residency for them in Hamburg, and for this they auditioned and hired drummer Pete Best in mid-August 1960. The band, now a five-piece, departed Liverpool for Hamburg 4 days later, contracted to club owner Bruno Koschmider for what would be a 3.5-month residency. Beatles historian Mark Lewison writes, "They pulled into Hamburg at dusk on the 17th of August, the time when the red light area comes to life. Flashing neon lights screamed out the various entertainment on offer, while scantily clad women sat unabashed in shop windows waiting for business opportunities." Koschmider had converted a couple of strip clubs in the district into music venues, and he initially placed the Beatles at the Indra Club. After closing Indra due to noise complaints, he moved them to the Kaiserkeller in October. When he learned they had been performing at the rival Top 10 club in breach of their contract, he gave the band 1 month's termination notice, and reported the underage Harrison, who had obtained permission to stay in Hamburg by lying to the German authorities about his age. The authorities arranged for Harrison's deportation in late November. 1 week later, Koschmider had McCartney and Best arrested for arson after they set fire to a condom in a concrete corridor. The authorities deported them. Lennon returned to Liverpool in early December, while Sutcliffe remained in Hamburg until late February with his German fiancée copyright E. Astrid Kirchherr, who took the first semi-professional photos of the Beatles. During the next 2 years, the Beatles were resident for periods in Hamburg, where they used Preludin both recreationally and to maintain their energy through all-night performances. In 1961, during their second Hamburg engagement, Kirchherr cut Sutcliffe's hair in the EXI existentialist style, later adopted by the other Beatles. When Sutcliffe decided to leave the band early that year and resume his art studies in Germany, McCartney took up the bass. Producer Bert Kaempfert contracted what was now a 4-piece group until June 1962, and he used them as Tony Sheridan's backing band on a series of recordings for Polydor Records. As part of the sessions, the Beatles were signed to Polydor for 1 year. Credited to Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers, the single, My Bonnie, recorded in June 1961 and released 4 months later, reached number 32 on the Music Mark chart. After the Beatles completed their second Hamburg residency, they enjoyed increasing popularity in Liverpool with the growing Merseybeat movement. However, they were also growing tired of the monotony of numerous appearances at the same clubs night after night. In November 1961, during one of the group's frequent performances at the Cavern Club, they encountered Brian Epstein, a local record store owner and music columnist. He later recalled, "I immediately liked what I heard. They were fresh, and they were honest, and they had what I thought was a sort of presence, a star quality." Epstein courted the band over the next couple of months, and they appointed him as their manager in January 1962. Throughout early and mid-1962, Epstein sought to free the Beatles from their contractual obligations to Bert Kaempfert Productions. He eventually negotiated a 1-month early release from their contract in exchange for one last recording session in Hamburg. Tragedy greeted them on their return to Germany in April, when a distraught Kirchherr met them at the airport with news of Sutcliffe's death the previous day from what was later determined as a brain hemorrhage. Epstein began negotiations with record labels for a recording contract. To secure a UK record contract, Epstein negotiated an early end to the band's contract with Polydor, in exchange for more recordings backing Tony Sheridan. After a New Year's Day audition, Decca Records rejected the band with the comment, "Guitar groups are on the way out, Mr. Epstein." However, 3 months later, producer George Martin signed the Beatles to EMI's Parlophone label. Martin's first recording session with the Beatles took place at EMI's Abbey Road Studios in London on 6 June 1962. Martin immediately complained to Epstein about Best's poor drumming and suggested they use a session drummer in his place. Already contemplating Best's dismissal, the Beatles replaced him in mid-August with Ringo Starr, who left Rory Storm and the Hurricanes to join them. The 4 September session at EMI yielded a recording of "Love Me Do", featuring Starr on drums, but a dissatisfied Martin hired drummer Andy White for the band's third session a week later, which produced recordings of "Love Me Do", "Please Please Me", and "P.S. I Love You". Martin initially selected the Starr version of "Love Me Do" for the band's first single, though subsequent repressings featured the White version, with Starr on tambourine. Released in early October, "Love Me Do" peaked at number 17 on the record retailer chart. Their television debut came later that month with a live performance on the regional news program People and Places. After Martin suggested re-recording "Please Please Me" at a faster tempo, a studio session in late November yielded that recording, of which Martin accurately predicted, "You've just made your first number one." In December 1962, the Beatles concluded their fifth and final Hamburg residency. By 1963, they had agreed that all 4 band members would contribute vocals to their albums A Circumflex Euro, including Starr, despite his restricted vocal range, to validate his standing in the group. Lennon and McCartney had established a songwriting partnership, and as the band's success grew, their dominant collaboration limited Harrison's opportunities as a lead vocalist. Epstein, to maximize the Beatles' commercial potential, encouraged them to adopt a professional approach to performing. Lennon recalled him saying, "Look, if you really want to get in these bigger places, you're going to have to change A Circumflex Euro, stop eating on stage, stop swearing, stop smoking." Lennon said, "We used to dress how we liked, on and off stage. He'd tell us that jeans were not particularly smart and could we possibly manage to wear proper trousers, but he didn't want us suddenly looking square. He'd let us have our own sense of individuality." Beatlemania and touring years. On the 11th of February 1963, the Beatles recorded 10 songs during a single studio session for their debut LP, "Please Please Me." The album was supplemented by the 4 tracks already released on their first 2 singles. Martin originally considered recording the Beatles' debut LP live at the Cavern Club, but after deciding that the building's acoustics were inadequate, he elected to simulate a live album with minimal production in a single marathon session at Abbey Road. After the moderate success of "Love Me Do", the single "Please Please Me" met with a more emphatic reception. Released in January 1963, 2 months ahead of the album of the same name, the song reached number 1 on every UK chart except Record Retailer, where it peaked at number 2. Recalling how the Beatles rushed to deliver a debut album, bashing out "Please Please Me" in a day, AllMusic's Stephen Thomas Erlewine comments, decades after its release, "The album still sounds fresh, precisely because of its intense origins." Lennon said little thought went into composition at the time. He and McCartney were just writing songs à la Everly Brothers, à la Buddy Holly. pop songs with no more thought of them than that a circumflex euro, to create a sound. And the words were almost irrelevant. Released in March 1963, the album initiated a run during which 11 of their 12 studio albums released in the United Kingdom through to 1970 reached number 1. The band's third single, From Me to You, came out in April and was also a chart-topping hit, starting an almost unbroken string of 17 British number 1 singles for the Beatles, including all but one of the 18 they released over the next 6 years. Issued in August, the band's fourth single, She Loves You, achieved the fastest sales of any record in the UK up to that time, selling 750,000 copies in under 4 weeks. It became their first single to sell 1 million copies, and remained the biggest-selling record in the UK until 1978. Their commercial success brought increased media exposure, to which the Beatles responded with an irreverent and comical attitude that defied the expectations of pop musicians at the time, inspiring even more interest. The band toured the UK 3 times in the first half of the year, a 4-week tour that began in February, the Beatles' first nationwide, preceded 3-week tours in March and May, a circumflex euro, June. As their popularity spread, a frenzied adulation of the group took hold. Greeted with riotous enthusiasm by screaming fans, the press dubbed the phenomenon Beatlemania. Although not billed as tour leaders, the Beatles overshadowed American acts Tommy Roe and Chris Montez during the February engagements and assumed top billing, by audience demand, something no British act had previously accomplished while touring with artists from the US. A similar situation arose during their May A Circumflex Euro, June tour with Roy Orbison. In late October, the Beatles began a 5-day tour of Sweden, their first time abroad since the final Hamburg engagement of December 1962. On their return to the UK on the 31st of October, several hundred screaming fans greeted them in heavy rain at Heathrow Airport. Around 50 to 100 journalists and photographers, as well as representatives from the BBC, also joined the airport reception, the first of more than 100 such events. The next day, the band began its fourth tour of Britain within 9 months, this one scheduled for 6 weeks. In mid-November, as Beatlemania intensified, police resorted to using high-pressure water hoses to control the crowd before a concert in Plymouth. Please Please Me maintained the top position on the record retailer chart for 30 weeks, only to be displaced by its follow-up, with the Beatles, which EMI released on the 22nd of November to record advance orders of 270,000 copies. The LP topped 500,000 albums sold in 1 week. Recorded between July and October, with the Beatles made better use of studio production techniques than its predecessor. It held the top spot for 21 weeks with a chart life of 40 weeks. Earlywine described the LP as a sequel of the highest order, one that betters the original. A reversal of then-standard practice, EMI released the album ahead of the impending single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, with the song excluded to maximize the single's sales. The album caught the attention of music critic William Mann of The Times, who suggested that Lennon and McCartney were the outstanding English composers of 1963. The newspaper published a series of articles in which Mann offered detailed analyses of the music, lending it respectability. With the Beatles became the second album in UK chart history to sell 1 million copies, a figure previously reached only by the 1958 South Pacific soundtrack. When writing the sleeve notes for the album, the band's press officer, Tony Barrow, used the superlative the fabulous foursome, which the media widely adopted as the Fab Four. First visit to the United States and the British invasion. EMI's American subsidiary, Capitol Records, hindered the Beatles' releases in the United States for more than a year by initially declining to issue their music, including their first 3 singles. Concurrent negotiations with the independent U.S. label Vee-Jay led to the release of some of the songs in 1963, but not all. Vee-Jay finished preparation for the album introducing The Beatles, culled from most of the songs of Parlophone's Please Please Me, but a management shakeup led to the album not being released. Then when it surfaced that the label did not report royalties on their sales, the license Vee-Jay signed with EMI was voided. A new license was granted to the Swan label for the single, She Loves You. The record received some airplay in the Tidewater area of Virginia by Gene Loving of radio station WGH and was featured on the Rate a Record segment of American Bandstand, but it failed to catch on nationally. Epstein brought a demo copy of I Want to Hold Your Hand to Capitol's Brown Meggs, who signed the band and arranged for a $40,000 U.S. marketing campaign. American chart success began after disc jockey Carol James of AM radio station WWDC, in Washington, D.C., obtained a copy of the British single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, in mid-December 1963 and began playing it on air. Taped copies of the song soon circulated among other radio stations throughout the U.S. This caused an increase in demand, leading Capitol to bring forward the release of I Want to Hold Your Hand by 3 weeks. Issued on the 26th of December, with the band's previously scheduled debut there just weeks away, I Want to Hold Your Hand sold 1 million copies, becoming a #1 hit in the U.S. by mid-January. In its wake, Vee-Jay released Introducing The Beatles to go along with Capitol's debut album, Meet the Beatles, while Swan reactivated production of She Loves You. On 7 February 1964, the Beatles left the UK with an estimated 4,000 fans gathered at Heathrow, waving and screaming as the aircraft took off. Upon landing at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, an uproarious crowd estimated at 3,000 greeted them. They gave their first live U.S. television performance 2 days later on The Ed Sullivan Show, watched by approximately 73 million viewers in over 23 million households, or 34% of the American population. Biographer Jonathan Gould writes that, according to the Nielsen rating service, it was the largest audience that had ever been recorded for an American television program. The next morning, the Beatles awoke to a largely negative critical consensus in the U.S., but a day later at their first U.S. concert, Beatlemania erupted at the Washington Coliseum. Back in New York the following day, the Beatles met with another strong reception during 2 shows at Carnegie Hall. The band flew to Florida, where they appeared on the weekly Ed Sullivan Show a second time, before another 70 million viewers, before returning to the UK on the 22nd of February. The Beatles' first visit to the U.S. took place when the nation were still mourning the assassination of President John F. Kennedy the previous November. Commentators often suggest that for many, particularly the young, the Beatles' performances reignited the sense of excitement and possibility that momentarily faded in the wake of the assassination, and helped make way for the revolutionary social changes to come in the decade. Their hairstyle, unusually long for the era and mocked by many adults, became an emblem of rebellion to the burgeoning youth culture. The group's popularity generated unprecedented interest in British music, and many other UK acts subsequently made their American debuts, successfully touring over the next 3 years in what was termed the British Invasion. The Beatles' success in the US opened the door for a successive string of British beat groups and pop acts such as the Dave Clark Five, The Animals, Petula Clark, The Kinks, and the Rolling Stones to achieve success in America. During the week of 4 April 1964, the Beatles held 12 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart, including the top 5.